I felt my head hit the concrete and, suddenly, I was outside my body. It was at that moment that I felt the most overwhelming and loving presence I have ever experienced. The story you are about to hear is a real account. The names of characters and places have been changed to preserve the privacy of the authors. If you believe in miracles or have experienced one, leave your opinion in the comments and subscribe. I will never forget that day. The day I decided I couldn't take it anymore, that life had become too heavy a burden to keep carrying. My name is Chris, and this is the story of how I died and came back to life. I had spent years sinking into a depression that seemed bottomless. Every morning was a struggle to get out of bed. Every night a torment of dark thoughts that wouldn't let me sleep. I felt alone, abandoned by a family that never wanted me and a society that seemed to have no place for me. That day, I woke up with a strange calmness. I had made a decision and, for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Today is the day, I told myself, looking in the mirror. My eyes, usually dull, had a peculiar shine. Was it the anticipation of what was to come? I left my small apartment without bothering to close the door. What did it matter? I wasn't coming back. I walked through the city streets, watching people come and go, busy with their lives. I wondered if anyone would notice my absence when I was gone. I arrived at the train station just before noon. I sat on a bench and watched the trains pass, one after another. I had studied the schedules for weeks. I knew exactly which train would end my suffering. Chris. Chris. I heard a familiar voice calling me. It was Maria, one of the few people who knew what I was going through. I tensed up. I didn't want anyone interfering with my plan. "What are you doing here?" I asked, unable to hide my irritation. "I saw you leave your house with that look. I knew you were going to do something crazy," she told me, her eyes full of concern. "It's none of your business, Maria." "Leave," I replied coldly. "I'm not leaving." "I won't leave you alone," she insisted, sitting beside me. We spent several minutes in silence, watching the trains pass. I could feel the tension in the air, almost palpable. Maria kept glancing at me, as if afraid I would throw myself onto the tracks at any moment. "You don't understand, do you?" I finally said, breaking the silence. "There's nothing here for me. Nobody needs me. Nobody wants me. Why keep fighting?" "You're wrong," she replied, with a trembling but firm voice. "I love you, and I know there are more people who do too, even if you can't see it right now." I let out a bitter laugh. "Love? Love doesn't exist, Maria. It's just an illusion we tell ourselves, so we don't feel so alone in this shitty world." I saw tears forming in her eyes, but I didn't care. I was determined. Nothing she could say would change my mind. The sound of the approaching train filled the station. It was the one I had been waiting for. I got up slowly, feeling as if every movement was happening in slow motion. "Chris, please," Maria pleaded, grabbing my arm. I jerked away roughly and began walking toward the edge of the platform. The train was getting closer and closer, its horns sounding like a heart-wrenching scream in the stillness of the afternoon. I was about to take the final step when I felt someone grab me from behind and pull me forcefully. It was Maria, who had run after me. "Let me go," I shouted, fighting against her grip. "No, I won't let you do this," she screamed, with a strength I didn't know she had. At that moment, my phone started ringing. The world seemed to stop for an instant. With trembling hands, I took the phone from my pocket. The name on the screen left me breathless. Mom? I hadn't spoken to her in years. Why was she calling now? Was it a sign? For a brief moment, I felt a spark of hope ignite in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. With shaking hands, I answered the phone. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Chris." I heard my mother's voice on the other end of the line. It had been years since I'd heard it, and yet, the sound instantly transported me to my childhood. To those few happy moments before everything went to hell. Mom, I stammered. Why are you calling me?" There was silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing broken, as if she were struggling to find the right words. "Your grandmother told me you were looking for me," she finally said. Her voice sounded cold, distant. Nothing like the warm tone I remembered from my childhood. "How did you get my number?" I asked, still unable to believe I was talking to her after so long. "I already told you. Your grandmother gave it to me," she replied, with a hint of irritation in her voice. "Look, Chris, I called you to tell you something and I want you to listen carefully." My heart started beating hard. Could it be possible? After all these years, would my mother finally apologize? Would she tell me she loved me, that she was sorry for abandoning me? "I'm listening, Mom," I said, trying to control the tremor in my voice. What followed was like a punch to the stomach. "I don't want you," she said, her voice cold as ice. "You're not my son. You never were and never will be. Stop looking for me." The world around me seemed to stop. My mother's words echoed in my head, each one like a stab straight to the heart. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like I was drowning in a sea of pain and rejection. But Mom," I tried to say, but she had already hung up. I stood there, with the phone stuck to my ear, listening to the dial tone. I don't know how much time passed. It could have been seconds, minutes, or hours. "Chris," Maria's voice snapped me out of my trance. What happened? Who was it? I looked at her, but it was as if I was seeing her through a veil. Everything seemed blurry, unreal. It was my mother. I finally managed to say, "Your mother?" Maria asked, surprised. "What did she say?" I let out a bitter laugh. "She told me she doesn't want me, that I'm not her son." I saw Maria's eyes fill with tears. She tried to hug me, but I pushed her away roughly. I didn't want her pity. I didn't want anyone's pity. "Chris, I'm so sorry," she began to say, but I interrupted her. "Don't be sorry," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm even to myself. "This just confirms what I've always known. Nobody cares about me. Nobody has ever cared about me." "That's not true," Maria insisted. "I love you, Chris, and I know there are more people who love you too." But her words sounded hollow, empty. At that moment, all I could hear was my mother's voice repeating over and over in my head, "I don't want you. You're not my son." I looked around. We were in Maria's car. I didn't remember how we got there. Everything seemed to be happening in slow motion, as if I was watching a movie of my own life. "Damn it," I muttered, more to myself than to Maria. "This fucking life." Maria kept talking, trying to console me, but her words weren't reaching me. It was as if there was a barrier between us, an invisible but impenetrable wall. Suddenly, everything became very clear. I knew what I had to do. There was no reason to keep fighting, to keep suffering. My own mother had confirmed what I had always suspected. I was worth nothing to anyone. "Maria," I said, interrupting whatever she was saying, "thank you for everything, but I can't take it anymore." "What do you mean?" she asked, fear evident in her voice. I didn't respond. Instead, I looked out the window. Maria had just made a right turn. The street was empty. It was now or never. "To hell with everything," I muttered, and before Maria could react, I opened the car door and jumped. The last thing I remember is Maria's heart-wrenching scream and the sensation of my head hitting the pavement. After that, everything went black. After jumping from the car, everything turned black. I don't know how much time passed, but suddenly, I felt as if I was waking from a deep sleep. I opened my eyes, expecting to see the pavement or maybe the ceiling of an ambulance. But what I saw left me breathless. I was floating. Yes, you heard right, fucking floating in the air. Below, I could see my body lying on the ground, motionless. I saw Maria running towards me, screaming like crazy. I saw the lights of an ambulance approaching, but everything seemed to be happening in slow motion, as if time had slowed down. Holy shit, I thought. Am I dead? I had barely finished forming that thought when I felt a presence. I can't describe it any other way. It was as if suddenly, all the air around me had become charged with electricity. And then, I felt it. It was the most overwhelming sensation I've ever experienced in my life. It was as if suddenly, all the love in the universe had concentrated in a single point, and that point was me. It was warm, comforting, but at the same time so powerful it almost hurt. "Who are you?" I asked, though I didn't actually speak. It was more like my thoughts were projecting towards that presence. The answer came immediately, not in words, but in an instant understanding that flooded my entire being. I am God. Now, let me clarify something. I was never very religious, you know? I grew up going to church because I was forced to, but I always thought it was all bullshit. The God they told me about was a vengeful bastard who was ready to send me to hell for any little thing. But this was different. This God wasn't the angry old man with a beard they had painted for me. It was pure love, pure acceptance. And suddenly, as if a blindfold had been removed from my eyes, I understood everything. I saw images, as if they were projected on a giant screen. I saw a woman walking down the street, dressed like a prostitute. I love her, God's voice said. Then I saw a man in a suit, with his briefcase, hurried and stressed. I love him, he said again. And then, a kid on a skateboard, smoking a joint. I love him too. I was left with my mouth open. How could he love everyone equally, even those whom society considered bad or sinners? As if reading my mind, which he probably did, God answered me, "Love doesn't judge, my son. Love simply loves." And then I felt it. A hug. But not just any hug. It was as if the entire universe was hugging me. It was warm, safe, comforting. For the first time in my life, I felt completely loved and accepted. All the wounds from my past, all the pain, all the loneliness seemed to vanish in that embrace. My mother's cruel words, the abandonment, the years of struggle and depression. All of that seemed so insignificant now. But I don't deserve this, I thought. I've done so many stupid things in my life. I've hurt people. I've tried to take my own life. How can you love me like this? The answer came immediately, filling me with an understanding that went beyond words. I love you because you are. Not for what you do or don't do. I love you because you are part of me, as is everything in the universe. I cried. I cried like I had never cried before in my life. But they weren't tears of sadness, but of relief, of gratitude, of a joy so deep that I can't even begin to describe. And then, God gave me a message. Go and tell everyone that I love them. How? I asked. How can I do that without them thinking I'm crazy? Simply love, was the answer. Love as I love you. Love is the universal language. When you truly love, without conditions, you are speaking my language. I wanted to stay there forever, wrapped in that infinite love. But I knew I had a mission to fulfill. I had to go back and share what I had experienced. Just when I thought nothing could surprise me more, I saw two angels appear by my side. One had a face like a beetle, bright and strange. The other looked more human, with curly hair and a flannel shirt, like a typical ranch guy. The angel on the left seemed kind of angry. "Are you sure you want to go back?" he asked me. "After everything you've been through?" For a moment, I hesitated. Did I really want to return to a world of pain and suffering after experiencing this perfect love? But then I remembered God's message. I had a mission to fulfill. I had to share this love with others who were suffering as I had. "Yes," I said firmly. "I want to go back." And in a blink, everything disappeared. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed, 2 days later, with doctors calling me the miracle. I woke up in the hospital feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Everything hurt, from the tips of my toes to the last hair on my head. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking at the bright light in the room. "He's awake," I heard someone shout. Suddenly, the room was filled with nurses and doctors, all talking at once. "It's a miracle," they were saying. "Nobody survives a fall like that." I could only think of one thing: the experience I had. The encounter with God, the infinite love I had felt, the mission I had been entrusted with. Had it been real? Or just a dream caused by the trauma of the fall? "Chris," I heard a familiar voice. It was Maria, standing in the doorway, her eyes swollen from crying. "Thank God you woke up." I wanted to tell her so many things. I wanted to tell her about my experience, about the love I had felt, about how everything had changed. But the words wouldn't come out. I could only smile weakly. The next few days were crazy. Medical exams, police visits to investigate the accident, journalists wanting to interview the living miracle. I just wanted to be left alone to process what I had experienced. Finally, after a week, they discharged me. Maria insisted that I stay at her house. "I'm not going to leave you alone after what happened," she told me. I didn't have the strength to argue. That night, sitting on Maria's couch, I finally had a moment of peace to reflect. How was I going to fulfill the mission I had been given? How was I going to share that unconditional love I had experienced? "Hey, Chris," Maria said, sitting beside me. "What really happened that day in the car?" I looked at her, hesitating. Would she believe me if I told her the truth? Or would she think I had gone crazy? "Maria," I started, taking a deep breath. "I need to tell you something, but it's going to sound really crazy." And so, I told her everything. About jumping from the car, about floating above my body, about the encounter with God and the angels. I told her about the infinite love I had felt and about the mission I had been given. I expected her to look at me like I was crazy, to call a psychiatrist. But to my surprise, Maria listened in silence, with tears in her eyes. "I believe you," she said when I finished. "I don't know why, but I believe you." That night marked the beginning of my new life. With Maria's support, I started looking for ways to fulfill my mission. It wasn't easy. Many thought I was crazy when I tried to talk about my experience. Others thought I was trying to start some kind of religious cult. But little by little, I found my way. I started volunteering at a community kitchen. There, among those most in need, I could begin to share the love I had experienced. Not with grand words or sermons, but with small acts of kindness and compassion. I especially remember one man, Don Chewy. He was an old man who lived on the street, always drunk and bad-tempered. Nobody wanted to get near him because he smelled bad and was always shouting profanities. One day, I approached him with a plate of food. "Get lost, kid," he shouted at me. But instead of leaving, I sat down beside him. "You know what, Don Chewy?" I said. "God loves you. And I do too." He looked at me like I had grown another head, but I didn't move. Every day, I would bring him his food and sit with him, even if it was just to receive his insults. After weeks, something changed. One day, when I sat beside him, Don Chewy didn't insult me. Instead, he looked at me with tearful eyes and said, "It's been years since anyone told me they loved me." That was the moment I knew I was on the right path. I wasn't changing the world all at once, but I was touching lives, one at a time. Over time, more people joined my cause. Maria was the first, of course. Together, we started a small support group for people who were going through difficult times. It wasn't anything formal. We just met to talk, to listen to each other, to remind ourselves that we were loved. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. There were days when the depression would return, when my mother's words would echo in my head. But in those moments, I remembered God's embrace, the infinite love I had felt, and that gave me strength to keep going. One day, while I was at the community kitchen, I saw a woman walk in. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place from where. It wasn't until she approached me that I recognized her. It was my mother. She looked older, more tired than I remembered. For a moment, I felt all the pain and resentment coming back. But then, I remembered the mission I had been given. "Hello, Mom," I said, surprising myself with the calmness in my voice. She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "Chris," she said, I'm sorry for everything." In that moment, I felt something release inside me. All the pain, all the resentment, melted away before the power of love and forgiveness. "It's okay, Mom," I said, hugging her. "God loves you, and I do too." And so, little by little, day by day, I fulfilled my mission. I didn't change the world overnight. I didn't become a great spiritual leader or perform miracles. But each day, with every small act of love, with every word of encouragement, I felt I was doing exactly what I was meant to do. Because in the end, that's what God had asked of me, simply to love. And that, my friends, is something we all can do. As the months passed, my life transformed in ways I never could have imagined. I was no longer the same depressed and hopeless Chris who had tried to take his own life. It was as if that near-death experience had planted a seed in me, a seed that was now growing and blooming. The community kitchen became my second home. Every day I arrived early, eager to help and share with those who needed it most. Don Chewy, that old man who had initially insulted me, was now my buddy. We would sit together for breakfast, and he would tell me stories about his youth, about how he had lost everything to alcohol and bad decisions. "Son," he told me one day, "you saved my life. I was ready to die, but you showed me that life was still worth living." His words touched my soul. It wasn't me who had saved him, I thought, but God's love flowing through me. But it wasn't all roses. There were days when depression tried to return, when doubts would assault me. What if it had all been a hallucination? What if I hadn't really experienced God's love? In those moments, I remembered the words I had heard during my experience. Simply love, and that's what I did. I focused on loving others, on being kind, on listening. And little by little, those dark thoughts would fade away. One day, while serving food, I saw a young man walk in. He looked emaciated, with deep dark circles under his eyes and a lost gaze. I recognized him immediately. It was me, a few years ago. I approached him with a plate of food. "What's your name, brother?" I asked. "Alex," he replied without looking up. "Welcome, Alex," I said. "You're safe here." He looked up, surprised. I guess he wasn't expecting that welcome. "Thank you," he mumbled. Over the next few weeks, Alex became my personal project. Each day I would talk with him, listen to him. He told me about his drug addiction, about how he had lost his family, his job, everything. "I don't see any point to life anymore, man," he told me one day. "Sometimes I think it would be better to end it all." His confession chilled my blood. It was exactly how I had felt before my experience. I knew I had to do something. "Look, Alex," I said, "I know exactly how you feel. I was there. I even tried to take my own life." His eyes opened in surprise. "You? But you always look so happy." I told him my story. Everything. The suicide attempt, the near-death experience, the encounter with God. I expected him to think I was crazy, but instead, he listened attentively. "And how did you manage to move forward?" they asked me when I finished. "I learned to love," I replied, "to love others and myself. And I promise you, Alex, that if you give love a chance, your life will change." That conversation marked a before and after for Alex. He began coming to the community kitchen not just to eat, but to help. I saw him smile for the first time. I saw him make friends. I saw him heal. Meanwhile, my relationship with Maria had also evolved. She wasn't just my friend anymore. She had become my partner, my accomplice in this mission of love. Together, we expanded our small support group. Now we met twice a week, and more people came each time. One day, while we were preparing the kitchen for dinner, Maria surprised me with a question. "Chris, have you thought about writing a book about your experience?" The idea left me stunned. "Me? Write a book? No way, Maria. I'm not a writer." "But you have a story to tell," she insisted. "A story that could help many people." Her words made me reflect. What if she was right? What if sharing my story could help others who were going through the same thing I had? That night, after closing the kitchen, I sat in front of my computer and began to write. The words flowed as if they had a life of their own. I wrote about my depression, about the suicide attempt, about my encounter with God. I wrote about the infinite love I had experienced and how it had changed my life. Writing was like reliving the entire experience. There were moments when I had to stop because tears wouldn't let me see the screen. Others where I laughed alone, remembering some funny anecdote. After months of work, the book was ready. I titled it From the Abyss to Light, a journey of love and redemption. Maria helped me find a small local publisher who agreed to publish it. On the day of the book launch, the community kitchen was fuller than ever before. Everyone was there: Don Chewy, Alex, my mother, the members of our support group, even some local journalists. While signing books and chatting with people, I realized something. I wasn't the same Chris who had jumped from that car years ago. I was a new, improved version, a version that had learned to love, to forgive, to live. And so, little by little, my mission was being fulfilled. I hadn't changed the entire world, but I had touched lives. I had planted seeds of love and hope. And that, my friends, was more than I had ever dreamed of. After that special night at the kitchen, things began to change quickly. The story of our family, of how love and forgiveness had reunited us after so many years, spread like wildfire in the community. People began coming to the kitchen not just to eat. but to seek hope. They came with their own stories of pain, broken families, addictions. And there we were, my father, my mother, and I, ready to listen and share our experience. "Son," my father said to me one day while we were washing dishes, "I never thought I'd be here, doing this with you." I looked at him, noticing the wrinkles around his eyes, the gray hair that now covered his head. "Neither did I, boss," I replied with a smile. But here we are. Over time, our small community kitchen became something bigger. We started offering emotional support workshops, trade classes for those looking for work, and even a small rehabilitation program for addicts, led by my father. If I could get out of the hole, he would say in meetings, anyone can. Seeing my father helping others, sharing his story without shame, filled me with a pride I never thought I'd feel for him. But not everything was perfect. With growth came new challenges. We needed more space, more resources, more volunteers. There were nights when I stayed awake, worried about how we were going to keep everything running. It was Maria who gave me the idea. "Chris," she told me one afternoon while we were closing the kitchen, "what if we seek support from local businesses? Your book has given you some fame. We could use it for something good." At first, the idea made me uncomfortable. I had never felt comfortable with the attention the book had brought me. But Maria was right. If I could use that platform to help more people, why not do it? So I set out to knock on doors. I spoke at chambers of commerce, at business meetings, even on local television. I told them our story, told them about the lives we were changing, and asked for their support. To my surprise, the response was overwhelming. Local businesses began donating food, materials for workshops, even money to expand our facilities. A local businessman, Don Ramon, approached me after one of my talks. "Son," he said to me, with tears in his eyes, "your story touched my heart. I lost my son to drugs years ago. If a place like yours had existed then, maybe things would have been different." Don Ramon became our biggest supporter, not just with resources, but with his time and business experience. Thanks to him, we were able to expand to other neighborhoods in the city. But with growth also came criticism. Some accused us of seeking fame. Others said we were profiting from others' pain. There were moments when I doubted, when I wondered if we were doing the right thing. It was in one of those moments of doubt when I received an unexpected call. It was Alex, that young man who had come to the kitchen years ago, lost and hopeless. "Chris," he said, his voice full of emotion, "I want you to know that today I'm 3 years clean, and it's thanks to you, to what you taught me about love and forgiveness." His words reminded me why we were doing all this. It wasn't for fame or recognition. It was for people like Alex, like Don Chewy, like my father. It was for all those lives we could touch and transform. With renewed energy, we moved forward. We expanded our programs, reached more communities. We saw families reunite, addicts recover, lives transform. One day, while observing the bustle in our now large community center, I felt a familiar presence. It was that same warm and loving sensation I had experienced during my encounter with God. "Thank you," I whispered, knowing that somehow, He was there, watching everything we had achieved. At that moment, I understood that my journey hadn't ended. In fact, it was just beginning. Each life we touched, each person we helped, was a new chapter in this story of love and redemption. And so, with a heart full of gratitude and hope, I prepared to face the new challenges that would come. Because I knew that as long as we kept alive that message of unconditional love, as long as we continued believing in the power of forgiveness and compassion, there would be no obstacle we couldn't overcome.